The spectre of global conflict haunts our geopolitical landscape. World War III, not a mere skirmish but a cataclysm that would transcend traditional battlefields. In our interconnected era, such a conflict would send political and economic shockwaves across continents, fundamentally altering societies we've built over generations. Today, we examine this hypothetical yet profoundly consequential scenario, exploring how global war would reshape our world order in ways both apparent and unforeseen. When we contemplate the economic battlefield of World War III, we must look beyond the physical destruction that defined past conflicts. In our digital age, the economic frontlines have shifted to an invisible realm. The arteries of global finance, exchanges and clearinghouses would become prime targets for sophisticated cyber attacks. Financial data manipulation could freeze transactions and erase critical records, triggering what analysts call a digital bank run. Imagine billions of digital wallets attempting mass withdrawals simultaneously as trust in banking systems collapses. The very concept of digital currencies would face an existential crisis. Global communication networks represent another critical vulnerability. The internet backbone, those sprawling undersea cables and satellite systems, could be severed through targeted attacks. Even with physical supply chains intact, the paralysis of information flow would grind economic activity to a halt, effectively dragging crucial functions back to pre-internet speeds. Consider our growing reliance on artificial intelligence. Modern economies depend on AI for everything from logistics to energy management to manufacturing. Malicious manipulation of these algorithms could create cascading failures across sectors. Self-driving logistics networks might freeze, energy grids could miscalculate and collapse, and automated factories might produce waves of defective products undetected. The digital disruption would cast a long shadow beyond any peace treaty. The psychological impact of widespread digital failures could foster deep distrust in technologies we've come to rely upon. Societies might retreat to localized, less efficient economic models simply for perceived security. Some economists even warn of a potential digital dark age, not a literal return to pre-technology times, but a significant rollback in our embrace of interconnected systems. This vulnerability is compounded by the lack of international cooperation in establishing cyber warfare norms. The imperative for robust cybersecurity infrastructure isn't just prudent business practice, it's essential for preventing the unprecedented economic devastation that digital warfare could unleash on our interconnected world. Throughout history, wars have been waged for land, trade routes, and oil. But a third world war would mark a profound shift in resource conflict. The battlegrounds wouldn't be defined merely by geography, but by access to the elements that power our technological age. Consider the rare earth elements. 17 metallic elements virtually unknown to the public, yet indispensable to modern life. From smartphones to renewable energy systems, from medical equipment to advanced defense technology, rare earths are essential components. China currently dominates this market, controlling up to 90% of global production. In a world war scenario, this supply could be disrupted or weaponized, triggering a desperate scramble for alternative sources. Nations would embrace aggressive resource nationalism, potentially igniting proxy conflicts across mineral-rich regions in Africa and South America. Beyond rare earths lies the critical triumvirate of lithium, cobalt, and nickel, the foundation of our electric future. Control over these resources would become paramount in a world pivoting toward electrification. The lithium triangle spanning Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile holds over half the world's known lithium reserves. The Democratic Republic of Congo possesses 70% of global cobalt. These regions, already vulnerable to instability, could become epicenters of proxy conflicts as external powers vie for strategic control. Even water, our most fundamental resource, would become a flashpoint. Climate change, exacerbated by wartime disruptions, would intensify droughts and alter rainfall patterns. Major river systems like the Nile and Mekong and the aquifers of the Middle East could transform into strategically vital assets contested not for navigation, but for survival itself. This intensified competition threatens to amplify the resource curse, where resource wealth paradoxically breeds instability. Nations rich in critical minerals yet politically fragile would become prime targets for external interference. Proxy wars could entrench existing conflicts, destabilize regions, and critically disrupt global supply chains. Analysts increasingly predict that the next global conflict may center not on ideology or territory, but on securing these critical resources. The great game of the 21st century could well be a resource grab for the materials that power modern technology and military might, fundamentally altering the geopolitical landscape. Beyond the immediate devastation of conflict, World War III would unleash a silent economic killer. Hyperinflation and cascading currency crises, massive wartime expenditures, coupled with widespread shortages and collapsing faith in major currencies, would create perfect conditions for hyperinflation on an unprecedented scale. At the heart of this potential meltdown lies the US dollar, the linchpin of global finance. Eroding confidence in this cornerstone currency could send shockwaves through every nation, destabilizing the entire financial architecture. Our interconnected global economy, once a source of prosperity, would become a conduit for economic contagion. Governments, desperately financing war efforts, would resort to printing money, injecting vast sums into economies already starved of goods. This deluge of currency chasing dwindling supplies would trigger catastrophic devaluation. While Weimar Germany's hyperinflation offers historical precedent, our globally intertwined world would experience this phenomenon at exponentially greater speed and scale. Compounding this economic tempest are the vulnerabilities in our global supply chains. Advanced warfare, wielding cyber weapons and precision strikes, could cripple these intricate networks with unprecedented efficiency. The very hallmark of modern production, just-in-time manufacturing, would transform from strength to critical weakness. Targeted attacks on ports and railway hubs could paralyze global trade. Cyber attacks on logistics software could bring the movement of goods to a standstill, creating widespread shortages and economic stagnation. We face a stark paradox. Our pursuit of efficiency has created breathtaking fragility. Companies that prioritized leanness over resilience would find themselves acutely vulnerable. A global conflict would force painful reevaluation, potentially shifting from globalized supply lines to localized production despite higher costs. Amid this chaos, some economists envision a potential currency reset, a fundamental restructuring of global financial architecture. New monetary systems might emerge, reshaping the financial landscape. The socio-economic fallout, exploding poverty, unemployment, and social unrest would require unprecedented international cooperation at precisely the moment when such collaboration becomes most difficult. For nearly a century, the United States has stood as the undisputed global superpower, architect of the post-World War II order, and guarantor of Pax Americana. Yet history teaches us that empires, however mighty, are not immutable. A third world war could accelerate America's decline, fragmenting global power and ushering in an era of regional hegemons. Several factors would converge to weaken American superpower status during global conflict. Decades of military overextension have already strained once seemingly inexhaustible capabilities. The astronomical costs of global war would further erode economic foundations. Paradoxically, one of America's primary power tools, financial sanctions, could become an instrument of its own decline. The intensified weaponization of the dollar could backfire spectacularly, eroding trust in the international financial system and triggering a seismic shift away from dollar dependence. Nations targeted by sanctions or wary of their future application would accelerate the search for dollar alternatives. The Chinese yuan, IMF's special drawing rights, or even gold-backed digital currencies could gain prominence. Countries might increasingly conduct trade in their own currencies, particularly within emerging regional blocs. Alternative payment systems like China's CIPS, designed to circumvent Western-dominated infrastructure, could see surging adoption. Rather than complete collapse, we might witness the emergence of a dollar divide, a fragmented financial landscape where the dollar remains dominant within Western-aligned spheres, while vast swathes of the global economy operate beyond its orbit, fundamentally diminishing US financial leverage. Into this power vacuum would rise regional hegemons, Russia reclaiming influence in its near abroad, China consolidating dominance across East and Southeast Asia, and emerging powers like India, Brazil, and Nigeria carving out their own spheres of influence. This wouldn't replicate crude colonialism of centuries past. Instead, neo-imperialism too would manifest through economic dependence, control of critical infrastructure, and political influence through calibrated aid. This shift toward regional hegemony promises new forms of competition and instability, both between emerging blocs and within them, fundamentally reshaping the global order. For decades, the internet has been celebrated as humanity's ultimate global commons, a borderless realm uniting us in unprecedented digital connection. But a World War III scenario could shatter this unity, fracturing the web into what experts call the Splinternet, a worldwide web no longer worldwide, but splintered into isolated digital ecosystems. Faced with relentless cyber warfare, nations would inevitably prioritize digital self-preservation over global connectivity. The concept of digital sovereignty, a nation's right to control its digital space, would be aggressively asserted. Countries would erect formidable digital walls, not physical barriers but sophisticated firewalls, meticulously regulating the digital arteries crossing their borders. The Internet, once a single interconnected entity, would fragment into a mosaic of national and regional systems. We might witness a Western Internet defined by its regulatory frameworks alongside a Chinese Internet with distinct standards and curated information landscape. Other regional blocs would likely establish their own digital spheres, creating a patchwork of internets interoperable in name only. Fueling this digital balkanization would be stringent data localization laws. Nations increasingly concerned about security would mandate that data generated within their borders must be stored and processed domestically. While ostensibly protecting citizens and bolstering national cybersecurity, these laws would severely hamper cross-border data flows, the lifeblood of multinational corporations and global scientific collaboration. In this fractured landscape, digital authoritarianism looms large. National security concerns, amplified by global conflict, would justify expanded government surveillance and censorship. Tools of digital control, honed under the guise of wartime necessity, could become permanent instruments of state power. Online privacy could become a relic, while freedom of expression might be stifled by algorithms of censorship. Perhaps most concerning is the potential demise of a globally connected, open internet. This fragmentation would profoundly impact global commerce, as digital borders impede the flow of goods and services. Scientific collaboration would be stifled by information silos. Cultural exchange would diminish, as national firewalls restrict access and curate content. Information, once freely flowing, would become a controlled commodity shaped by national narratives. Even cybersecurity efforts would be undermined by this fragmentation. Coordinating defense across incompatible digital ecosystems, each with unique protocols and standards, would become exponentially more difficult. The Internet's promise of a globally connected world risks dissolving into the fragmented reality of the Splinternet, a digital mirror of a world fractured by conflict. Beyond shifting borders and economic collapse, World War III would carve deep scars into the fabric of human society. These wounds, though less visible than physical destruction, would shape generations to come. Societal fractures that unravel the delicate threads binding communities together. Consider our climate, already a planet under pressure. Global conflict would unleash environmental devastation, industrial targets burning, pollutants choking the skies, and the specter of environmental warfare looming. Climate change, far from being addressed, would be catastrophically accelerated. Regions already vulnerable to environmental degradation and resource scarcity, further destabilized by conflict, would become uninhabitable. This wouldn't produce merely economic migrants seeking opportunity. Entire communities would be forced to flee, a climate refugee crisis of unprecedented scale. Imagine borders overwhelmed, humanitarian systems collapsing under the weight of millions displaced not by choice, but by survival necessity. Food shortages would become endemic, disease outbreaks rampant, and social unrest constant in both departure lands and reluctant receiving nations. This represents not just a refugee crisis, but a potential prelude to societal collapse in fragile regions, a fundamental destabilizing force globally. Concurrently, we'd witness the insidious creep of authoritarianism. Facing existential threats, governments would inevitably invoke emergency powers. Martial law, once a temporary measure, could become a permanent state of affairs. Surveillance would expand, civil liberties erode, freedom of speech, assembly rights, and privacy protections, all sacrificed for wartime necessity. Arbitrary detentions and power abuses, once unthinkable in democracies, might become commonplace. Military authorities, granted extraordinary wartime powers, might resist relinquishing control, embedding authoritarian structures into society's foundations long after hostilities cease. Perhaps the most corrosive societal scar would be the crisis of trust. Information warfare, relentless propaganda and disinformation would become a central weapon. Societies would drown in manipulation, where discerning fact from falsehood becomes nearly impossible. This toxic information environment would erode trust in institutions meant to guide and protect governments, media, and scientific communities. In this fertile ground of distrust, Conspiracy theories would flourish not as fringe beliefs, but mainstream narratives, further fragmenting societies into warring factions. This psychological scarring, shattered faith in institutions and each other, might prove more intractable than physical damage. Rebuilding societies would require not just infrastructure, but the infinitely more complex task of mending fractured social bonds and restoring fundamental faith in shared reality. Predicting the precise battle lines of a hypothetical World War III is an exercise in speculation, a glimpse into a future we hope to avoid. Global alliances are never static but fluid, shaped by geopolitical interests, economic dependencies, and unpredictable events. By examining current international relations, however, we can discern potential fault lines that might define the next global conflict. The alliances forged in World War III would likely bear little resemblance to familiar historical blocs. Nations facing existential threats would re-evaluate long-standing allegiances, prioritizing survival and strategic advantage above all. The concept of fixed alliances might become a casualty of war, replaced by pragmatic partnerships of necessity. Certain key players emerge through the fog of speculation. The United States would likely stand with traditional allies, NATO members in Europe, and strategic partners in the Asia-Pacific, like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines. Yet even these seemingly solid alliances would face unprecedented strain under the pressure of global conflict. Russia, isolated and confronting a resurgent West, might solidify partnerships with nations like Iran and North Korea that share adversarial stances toward Western powers. The true wildcard remains China. Despite its strategic partnership with Russia, Beijing's support in full-scale global conflict is far from assured. China's cautious pragmatism and vast economic interests might dictate a more nuanced role, carefully calibrated to maximize advantage while minimizing the catastrophic risks of direct confrontation. Beyond major powers, the BRICS nations add another layer of complexity. This diverse grouping, already challenging Western institutions, could find its cohesion either strengthened or fractured by global conflict, reshaping power dynamics. Then there are the known unknowns, nations whose allegiances remain unpredictable, yet whose influence could prove decisive. Countries like India with its complex international relationships, Brazil with regional ambitions, and Middle Eastern nations perpetually navigating volatile waters. These swing states could tilt the scales of conflict in unforeseen directions. An ideological dimension might emerge alongside geopolitical realignments. The contest between democratic and authoritarian governance models could intensify, with nations aligning not just by strategic interest, but by fundamental principles, further complicating alliance calculations. Beyond traditional frameworks, novel issue-specific coalitions might form around common threats, like cybersecurity, resource scarcity, and pandemics. These flexible partnerships could transcend ideological divides, representing an evolutionary step in international relations, reflecting our complex interdependencies. We've traversed a sobering landscape, a world transformed by global conflict, digital economies fractured, resources desperately contested, power structures upended, the internet itself splintered, and societies scarred by division. This exploration of World War III serves as a stark reminder of our world's profound interconnectedness and the fragility of peace. Let this not be prophecy, but a call for diplomacy and cooperation to prevent such catastrophe. If this journey has resonated, join the conversation. Our collective future remains unwritten.